Yo, what's going on, everybody? It's Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, and this week I've got some decks for you so that way you can be prepared for the tournament weekend, for just playing on the ladder with maybe a different deck than you've been playing, and in anticipation of the win streak event. So, stay with me as I show you the decks. I talk about each one of them and show you some gameplay on the side because I know a lot of you enjoyed that layout. So let's get to it. So as we get started here, I wanted to quickly show you a nice little tool that you can use to check out some of the decks and how they're performing is to go to play.limitlesstcg.com and then click decks. From there, you'll be able to also filter Pokemon Trading Card Game Pocket. And basically from here, you can kind of scroll through and see a lot of data. Now, one of the more important things that some people may be looking for is something like a win percentage. And, you know, the first deck that pops up when you sort by win percentage is actually a Greninja Farfetchd deck that I'm going to show you here in a second. But you can also kind of scroll down and, you know, there's only been 39 instances of this being recorded. So, you know, it's a little bit low compared to, you know, a lot of the other decks that have been played a ton of times. But it's still, you know, better than a lot of these other numbers that you're seeing. And again, like, it's just a tool that you can use when you take a look and try to judge, you know, like what's the most popular deck right now. You can kind of see, you know, hey, there's Mewtwo, there's Gyarados, there's Pikachu, and so on. And I'm actually going to show you a few different decks, including the Greninja Farfetchd deck list. But you can also sort for no EX, and although the data is a little bit skewed because of the time frame, so that one's a little bit trickier. But that's just a way that you can sort, you know, some standard decks, which is basically the regular format. But let's get into some different decks as well. So this is a deck that I have been a big fan of, and you're actually seeing gameplay of it on the other side of the screen right now. But I actually really do enjoy this Pidgeot EX deck list, and it's something that I've actually made a video about. But since I made the video, I did make one change where I took out 1x speed for a red card. And if you watched that video, basically the big reason why I did that is because so many people were just like playing around my Hitmonlee and my Pidgeot. And so they would end up having 6, 7, 8 cards in hand, and they're still ripping research, and they're just holding, you know, Pokemon in their hand and cards in their hand. So, you know, I'm like sitting there like, dang, dude, I wish I had red card. So I ended up adding red card, and basically I'm going to punish you for playing cards, but I'm also going to punish you if you don't play cards. That's kind of the idea behind it. You know, I don't want to get too much into the red card debate and everything. Just think about it like this. If people are purposely not playing cards, but they're still using professor's research, and they're still using Pokeballs and then just keeping them in their hand. Imagine when you red card them down to 3 cards and they previously had, you know, 7 or 8 cards. Like, that's a big deal. Even 6 cards is a big deal. Okay. And so you're limiting their options, as well as putting pressure with something like a Farfetchd or something like a Marshadow or something like, you know, maybe hopefully a Pidgeot, right? Or a Pidgeotto. So again, this is the deck list. You know, the cards are pretty self-explanatory. You're playing the fighting box cards to have constant early game attackers, so that way you can slowly build up that Pidgeotto into a Pidgeot on your bench. And you're able to finish games sometimes with just the fighting Pokemon, just because they'll have a type advantage, or because you'll be able to get a 2-for-1 where you're sacking one Pokemon, but you're still, you know, dealing damage with it, and then Marshadow comes in and cleans up the EX. And from that point, you know, it kind of turns into, you know, you're already ahead. There's also instances where, you know, you're going to be able to snipe a Magikarp and then Poke-Flute it back. You know, that's really nice. And Poke-Flute is kind of like a finisher card. You know, it's not necessarily the same as like a Raichu and Lieutenant Surge, but think of it as like a card that's going to finish things off when your opponent thinks that they're playing around, you know, your Pidgeot EX. So again, really fun deck, a really good deck in my opinion. I think that more people should try it out personally. And, you know, for the win streak event, I think it'd be a fun deck to play. For tournaments, I think it's a fun deck to play. And if you're just looking for something different outside the box to play, that's also a very solid pick. So anyways, let me know if you have questions about this deck. And again, I do have a full video dedicated to it already on the channel, so you can check that out. But this is definitely one of my favorite decks at the moment. And, you know, I may have a tournament that's like an invitational coming up soon. And, you know, don't be surprised to see me playing this deck. So moving on to the number one win rate deck on limitlesstcg.com, and I want to take a second to give a shout out to the people that played this deck and got a lot of good results. I know people like Swoosh, people like Mobes, their whole team. Shiny, I believe, is one of them as well that got some good results. And they had a really good time playing this deck and putting it in the limelight. So I'm going to talk about these cards and talk about this deck a little bit more, but you should probably already see some similarities to what this deck is doing when you compare it to what that Pidgeot EX deck is doing as well, that you just kind of finished hearing me talk about and just clinched or is close to clinching a game here on the right side. But basically, instead of the whole Pidgeot EX engine, you're actually just playing the Greninja engine, so that way you can actually snipe things that may retreat. And one important key point about this deck is it's not playing water energy. And there's people that have fooled around with playing water energy, but I would just sit here and tell you don't do that, right? You're just adding more chances for your deck to get beat, not by your opponent, but by RNG. Okay, and you want to try to limit that as much as possible, and so do not play those water energies. So keep that in mind as you're playing this deck, and then we'll kind of talk about some of these different card choices and why they're effective as well. But again, this is the number one win rate deck as of right now when you look at Limitless and sort by win percentage, and I think a lot of people are going to continue playing this deck even on the ladder event or in tournaments. So let's talk about these card choices. Okay, so running through these card choices, one of the big things that I'll point out is that your Greninja is never going to attack. However, there will be instances where your Frogadier, which is the stage 1 of the Greninja line, might actually be able to deal some critical damage, especially if there's a type advantage. So keep that in mind as you're sort of deciding, hey, what should I be pivoting into, and is there a way that I can actually get more damage, and so on. The Greninja is going to sit on the bench and probably deal enough damage from the bench to either finish something off or put it in range to where now Marshadow can finish it off. Because you got to think, that's 120 damage, maybe even as much as 140 if you get 2 Greninja pings. Okay, now it's very important to keep in mind, I know a lot of you know this, that if your Pokemon gets knocked out by a status effect, or if it gets knocked out by an opposing Greninja, your Marshadow will not trigger, so you will not be doing 100 damage. Now, going into the Hitmonlee, the Hitmonlee is just one of those things that is able to put things in range. And you'll notice there's no red card in this list, and that's a whole nother topic, right? But Hitmonlee can, dissuade opponents from putting things on the bench, so that's something you have to be aware of. However, in the event that they do put these big EXs, those Mewtwo's, those Moltres, or they evolve to Charizard, they evolve to Arcanine EX, you're able to use your Hitmonlee to put those Pokemon closer into range to where Marshadow can come in and finish it off. Farfetchd is also really, really good, and a lot of the times you're going to really enjoy when you open up Farfetchd, and it's a really good way to punish those people that are playing 50 HP basics, for example, execute players, people that may be playing, Pidgeot decks, but they're playing the 50 HP basic. So there's a lot of different ways that you can actually punish people as well. And it's so important to also remember that 40 damage, it can really be the difference in you eventually knocking out one of their main EX Pokemon. So Farfetchd, very good. I know a lot of you know this. And then obviously Marshadow is something that kind of ties the whole deck together, right? Whenever you're using Marshadow in a deck like this, you're pretty much baiting your opponent into knocking out your Hitmonlees, knocking out your Farfetchd, and then being able to revenge KO with Marshadow. Now, if you're playing against, maybe grass decks are going to be something that's really tough for this deck to deal with. And so if you anticipate a big grass meta, maybe this isn't the deck for you. But the main reason why grass decks are going to play a really big factor in being able to beat decks like this is just because of Erica and the fact that Exeggutor EX is so tanky. And that's something that I should definitely mention with the Pidgeot deck too. When it comes to grass decks, it can get a little tricky because their attacks are so cheap, but they can potentially put you in one-hit KO range, or they can just KO you with some good coin flips on their end. And on top of that, even if you're able to put some early damage with stuff like Farfetchd or with stuff like Hitmonlee, because they run cards like Erica, your 2 attacks with Hitmonlee may just get healed away, and now they only have 10 damage on their Pokemon. So like that's something to definitely pay attention to, and something that can make it a little bit difficult to overcome. And then when it comes to decks that have just like a lot of HP, for example, like Arcazard, right? Like Arcanine EX and Charizard EX, they're very tanky. But the thing is, this deck is trying to hit you so fast that you're not able to get to a point where one of their Pokemon can just sweep you. Now, it's the same idea with like, if you're playing against any of those other big bulky decks, maybe like a Gyarados deck, you're trying to chip things into range, things like a Gyarados EX, that maybe you can just be able to revenge KO the Gyarados EX. Now the other advantage against Gyarados EX is obviously Hitmonlee, and if they decide to put the Magikarp in the active, well, you're using Farfetchd to knock it out. And this deck has the room for double X speed because they're not playing red card. And also it has room for double Farfetchd as well. So, you can use that to your advantage when you're playing this deck. But again, this deck is really solid. Again, when you take a look at the metrics, when you take a look at the matchups, you can see the matchup data on Limitless. And again, I think that the biggest problem that this deck has is, maybe an early Arcanine. Yeah, that's an issue, but that's an issue for every deck. And then also those grass decks with Erica that can really put you in a little bit of a clock, right? So keep that in mind when you're playing this deck. Again, 1 Sabrina, 1 Giovanni. Try to be smart about how you use the Sabrina, for example. Usually you want to make sure that you're using it to clinch a win or to clinch a knockout that puts your opponent so far behind they can't win. When it comes to Giovanni, Giovanni is something that I would also think about the same way. I wouldn't just use Giovanni to add more damage. I would only use Giovanni in scenarios where it's going to put your opponent into a knockout, or if there's the scenario where you use Greninja and then Giovanni to KO something. But I wouldn't want to just use Giovanni just to use it and get them in a scenario where they may have potion to punish you. So always kind of think about that, and that's just good fundamental gameplay when it comes to playing this game. So I think a lot of you already know that. But again, just trying to cover anything that may be a question mark, because again, you're not seeing a ton of games with this deck and it's still relatively kind of new, but just kind of going over each card to help you out. And again, I hope that you guys are enjoying the gameplay over here on the side. You can see one of the big strengths of this deck is being able to pivot in and out of the active. So you're able to put damage on Pokemon and pivot out, and then at the same time you have Greninja in some games that's able to basically say, hey, I'm gonna beat you whether I'm attacking you or whether I'm using something like a Greninja to secure my last knockout. And that's pretty much what you're seeing in this game right here to the side, right? I was able to put them on a clock with Greninja after putting some damage on their Articuno, and the thing is, their deck did what it was supposed to do, except see a Greninja, but their deck did pretty much what it was wanting to do, right? It got energy out, it used Vaporeon to move them around, it used Leaf to pivot, and so that way they could kind of not get KO'd, but still keep pivoting into other Pokemon. But eventually, like I said, because Greninja has the ability to snipe, even if you don't have cards like Hitmonlee sometimes, I'm going to be able to use this Greninja ability, and I drew the Hitmonlee anyways, but I'm going to be able to use the Greninja ability to secure the game. Okay, so speaking of grass decks and how good they can be, here's the version of grass that I would potentially look at playing in some of these events and tournaments, and just being able to play it on the ladder for fun. But this is a deck that has got a lot of advantages against certain matchups, and the worst thing that it can run into is some of those fire decks, right? Those fire decks are a big trouble. But let's talk about this deck list, and then we'll talk about its strengths as well while you go ahead and check out some of the gameplay. But the biggest thing that you'll notice with this deck is that it is playing the 2-2 lineup of Exeggutor, and then it's playing 2 of the entire Superior line, and then 2 of the Celebi line. For the trainers, pretty straightforward. There's one thing you could probably mix and match. You could probably take out the X speed for another Leaf. That's definitely a thing. But I think that outside of that, you can definitely get away with playing this exact deck list. When you take a look at the strengths of this deck, the strengths of this deck are an early Exeggutor EX. Like, you just have to understand, when it comes to this game, if you go first, usually you're at a disadvantage. However, if you have that Exeggutor and your execute doesn't get KO'd, Exeggutor on your turn 2 is a huge deal. And when you take a look at the win percentages, you'll notice that the superior decks that are playing Exeggutor along with Celebi are typically better performers. Now, obviously, there's going to be outliers, but if you're looking for the best way to play Superior, the best way to play Celebi, and the best way to play Exeggutor, it's probably this deck right here. Now, one of the other big advantages that this deck has is that while you have that Exeggutor EX swinging, you're able to slowly build up your Celebi, you're able to hopefully have time to find your Superior, and Erica helps extend the life of any of these Pokemon in the deck. So when you take a look at the total package of this deck, it's got really good matchups against some decks, especially something like a Pikachu or something like an electric deck. And the advantage gets even bigger whenever you draw Exeggutor EX early in the game and are able to play it. Now, even matchups like Mewtwo, which again, Mewtwo the highest played deck in terms of tournament gameplay, something like a Mewtwo is going to have a hard time getting through Exeggutor EX simply because it's bulk. So again, it just comes down to, hey man, the earlier you can find that Exeggutor EX, a lot of your matchups are going to be winnable. Even against some of those fire decks, when you start talking about Arcazard, when you start talking about Volcarona, even though that deck's pretty bad, I wouldn't play it. But when you start talking about those matchups, a lot of the time, one of the big factors that you can use to come back and win those games is an early Exeggutor. And so again, this is a deck that I think a lot of people have been, people have been warming up to this deck. It's just that there was a little bit of time before where people weren't sold on the best way to play it. Like, people were playing Delmice, and just honestly speaking, Delmice is just not good. When you talk about comparing, hey, Delmice, even though it's just, 2 spots in your deck to 4 spots with Exeggutor EX, the upside of Exeggutor EX is just so much better. And also, it addresses the weaknesses that the deck has, right? Like, the biggest thing that you're going to run into when you start playing this deck is, oh man, it took me a while to get my Celebi going because, I only was getting 2 coin flips, and, you can only deal 50 damage sometimes. But when you get that Exeggutor EX out early and it's able to tank some damage, and, you flip 1 heads, all of a sudden your opponent's like, man, I got to retreat. If I don't retreat, I'm giving up a prize. And again, like, this is going to be a deck that's going to match up pretty well into those fighting decks that we've been seeing, those Aerodactyl EX decks. Although it's worth noting, Aerodactyl EX can be kind of awkward against this deck, but you do have Leaf and X-Speed to get out of the active, so that way you can evolve. So keep that in mind. And again, I do think that this deck is worth playing if you have the cards. It has yet to really take down one of the big tournaments like an Ursi or a PLL tournament, right? But in the early days of Mythical Island, you saw a lot of people taking down events with this grass deck. So again, I think it does have some pretty good matchups. And, if you're looking for something that is pretty solid against most decks, especially if you draw Exeggutor EX, this is a very solid deck, and you're going to win a lot of games with it. Okay, so it wouldn't be a video of, some of the best decks if I didn't talk about Pikachu EX, because again, it's just one of those decks that's just super consistent at what it's trying to do. It's usually one of the fastest decks in the game because it has the potential to put 90 damage on the board very early and just say deal with it. And it's got some really good techs, right? Like, it's got a really good toolbox of cards that it can use to beat its oppositions. So let's talk about this deck, and I've already made a video about it, but I wanted to elaborate on some things, especially like Dedenne, because there was a lot of comments about that. But this is a deck that can definitely get you your win streak. It can definitely do well in tournaments, and it's just fun to play if you're relatively new to the game and you're wanting to play something that's still very powerful. So this deck is going to start with the 2/2 Blitzel and Zebstrika line, 2 Pikachu EX, 1 Dedenne, 1 Zapdos, and 1 Electabuzz. Now, let's talk about Dedenne first. So, Dedenne is one of those cards that you're probably not attacking with unless there are some scenarios where you need one more turn. And that one extra turn is going to allow you to attach an energy, and then all of a sudden you're back in the game because now your Pikachu or your Zapdos is ready to go. The other thing that Dedenne can do in some really awkward matchups is, hey, if you see something like a Moltres on your opponent's side of the board as you start, well, Dedenne can paralyze it and also deal 30 damage to it. And now, if you have Pikachu EX, well, next turn, you attach to Pikachu EX, and that Moltres is in danger of being KO'd. So again, like you start looking at it, and at first glance, something like a Dedenne seems like, I don't know. But the way you have to think about it is, it's an in case of emergency card. You're probably not, going out there and saying, oh man, I got to start the game attacking with Dedenne all the time. Like, it's literally a card where, hey, it's only worth one prize. It only takes one energy to attack, and it's one energy to retreat. So if I land a heads and paralyze my opponent, that could be the difference in me getting enough time to come back in this game or take control of this game. And now a game that was kind of maybe up in the air is fully in my control. And you'll see that happen in something like a water matchup as well. I mean, don't forget, Dedenne is still capable of KOing a Magikarp if it's in the active spot, just because of that weakness. And I know that's a very niche scenario, but let's take it a step further. What about Gyarados? What if you're facing down a Gyarados that's in the active and you have Dedenne? Well, you paralyze it. If you paralyze it, it's down to 150 HP. Okay. The next time you hit it, it's down to 120 HP. So that means, in theory, a Pikachu with Giovanni would be enough to KO that Gyarados EX, even though, you only had a Dedenne and a Pikachu EX. Now, granted, yes, you have to have a full bench and you have to find a way to replace the Dedenne after it gets KO'd, but it's just one of those things that it doesn't seem like a very powerful card, but when it's hitting for weakness or when it's flipping heads and all of a sudden, you've got that extra turn you needed, you realize that the powerful effect that something like a 60 HP Dedenne can have. And a lot of people are still, like I said, they're still kind of questioning it, but I'm here to tell you, 100% try it out. Like that's the worst thing that you could do, is write off a card without trying it out. I would 100% at least try it out, get a feel for it, and give it a chance. But 100%, if you're playing a deck list like this, I do think that Dedenne it deserves a spot. Now, if you're playing something with Lieutenant Surge, that's a whole nother topic. I don't know if you have room for it, but so that's enough on Dedenne. When it comes to the one Zapdos, it's pretty, it's kind of self-explanatory. You don't necessarily need to, because you're kind of using that second spot for a tech card like an Electabuzz or a Dedenne. And also, like, there's going to be some matchups where opening up Zapdos is just a lot better than any of the other Pokemon in your deck. The other thing is the Electabuzz. The Electabuzz is oddly enough going to be able to win some games that you wouldn't expect yourself to be able to win, simply because sniping for 40 is kind of good. Now, it's not going to be good every single time, but there are some scenarios where they potion out of a hill range and your Electabuzz is able to hit that damage breakpoint. Now, there's also other scenarios where putting 40 damage on something like a Gyarados, something, like an Articuno, something like a Moltres, something like a Mewtwo is going to soften it up enough to where, hey, now, I just need, I need one more turn, right? And then when you think about it as well, getting 2 turns to attack with Electabuzz on some of those Pokemon is just game changing. And if they're not, able to answer that Electabuzz might just solo that EX. Okay. So again, very good card, definitely worth playing. And when you take a look at the rest of the deck list, again, you're just looking at double Sabrina to try to help some of those matchups where, hey, Pikachu's able to KO something very early and quick in the game. The double potion is also really good. It's good in the grass matchup. It's good in the mirror matchup. It's good in so many matchups. And then a card like Giovanni helps fix your damage. And again, all those rules apply that I was talking about earlier. Try to use Sabrina when it's going to clinch a game or when it's going to clinch a clutch knockout. Try to use Giovanni when it's going to clinch a knockout. Try not to use those cards for other reasons. There's going to be some times where you're trying to defensively play Sabrina, and that's okay. But again, by and large, try to keep that in mind when you're using those cards. So let me know what you think about these decks. There's obviously 100 other decks that I could be talking about, but I wanted to single these decks out so that way you could be prepared for that win streak event and be prepared for the tournaments that are going down this weekend and maybe in the future. Let me know what you think in the comments. I appreciate you for taking time out of your day to, let me be background noise. Maybe you learned something, or hey, maybe it was entertainment. But again, thank you so much, and until next time, peace.